You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. Welcome to Mysteries and Monsters. October the 2nd, 1959, saw the debut of arguably the most influential science fiction and fantasy show of all time, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. During the next 5 years, and over 156 episodes, The Twilight Zone gave us stories and characters that have stood the test of time. It also gave us a smorgasbord of talent, from writers such as Matheson, actors such as Shatner, Bronson, Coburn, Montgomery, Meredith, and so many more, across a variety of fields. It has inspired hundreds of films, books, and directors to this very day, and despite its latest deeply underwhelming reboot by Jordan Peele, The Twilight Zone still continues to inspire, entertain, and enthrall us to this day. It also gave us one of the most iconic theme tunes in history that still resonates with us today. Joining me to discuss this pop culture phenomenon is artist, pop culture historian, and lecturer Arlen Schumer. We discuss his love of the show, its influences, some of the themes that Rod Serling used, and some of our favourite episodes. I hope you enjoy our journey deep into the heart of The Twilight Zone. Before we get there, Dan Wayne, who was a guest on episode 68 with Ken Walker to discuss his film Big Fur, has released it on VOD, so check out the link in this week's show notes to track it down. All the best, Dan, and I recommend the film highly. It's great fun. Don't forget, you can support the show via Patreon by clicking on the link in this week's show notes for additional shows and bonus content, as well as early release of all the episodes for the regular show. We're across all social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can also subscribe and support the show via our YouTube channel under Mysteries and Monsters. Artwork for this week's show, as always, by my brother Dean Bestel, and the show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys. Now, let's join Arlen Schumer for a journey into the Twilight Zone.
You're traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
As groundbreaking television shows go, few can hold a candle to The Twilight Zone. Rod Serling's beloved anthology series still resonates across the decades, 61 years since it debuted on CBS in 1959. Joining me to discuss this pop culture phenomenon is Arlen Schumer, comic book artist and historian, and a lover of American pop culture. Arlen, I'm delighted to welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters. Thank you for joining me, sir. So, Arlen, the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
I mean, here we are, almost 61 years later. We're coming up to the anniversary in October of the very first episode debuting. I mean, what was it that hooked you? Because I find it incredible that it still resonates to people today who are discovering it and looking back on the themes and the stories that were brought into living rooms back in the late 50s and early 60s.
Well, you know, on a personal level, Paul, the very first visual image I can recall as a child, I had to be 4.5 years old, was the black and white Twilight Zone eyeball hanging in space, which was the last of their graphic openings that debuted in January of 63. So I remember, now that's my first visual image. Now, isn't it interesting that like 30 years later, I end up doing a coffee table art book on the Twilight Zone? And when you take off the dust jacket, the embossed in white ink image on the black cloth cover is that Twilight's eyeball, which is a perfect metaphor for what I've done with my life career as an artist and a graphic designer, is an illustrator, whatever it is. I've taken the images that influenced me as a child and recontextualized them as either books or articles, exhibits, webinars now, lectures, and recontextualize it as, in a sense, art. To me, Twilight Zone is television art. And the fact that we are talking about it 61 years later lives up to the definition of art, which we've always been told has to be timeless. And what does that mean to be timeless? It means that an image should be able to speak to not only a work of art has to be both of its time and ahead of its time, ergo timeless. Look at a work like Guernica by Picasso. That was a site-specific work, his reaction to the bombing of the Spanish town of Guernica by the Nazi-led Franco forces, if you know your history. And he did this incredible mural about how the town was destroyed and all of that death and misery. Now, it was of its time, obviously, and yet it's also one of his most famous works that still people can look at today and feel something from it. So a teenager should be able to look at Guernica and know nothing about the actual bombing of the town of Guernica and still get something that we get when we go to a work of art, whether it's a movie, whether it's a record, whether it's a book.
Yeah.
We get a reflection of life. We get a reflection of ourselves. We get a reflection of the synthesis of ourselves and that work of art. It's like when you hear a song and you think about a romance at 30 years ago. You know, somebody posted the video to the great song Boys of Summer by Don Henley. Which I think will always be his greatest solo song after leaving the Eagles. And if you remember, the video from it was shot in black and white, and it was very evocative, and it had that couple running on the beach, that beautiful young couple embracing and kissing. And somebody posted it on Facebook, and I responded with a sigh because I said, you know, I lived that song.
Yeah.
Back in 1984, I was suffering from a lost summer romance that, I mean, when that song came out in you know, the summer of 84, I was living it.
Yeah.
And here is the song by Don Henley that is like my life. Now, it's corny and cliche, but this is why we listen to music. This is why we go to art museums and galleries and read books and indulge in art is to get our life reflected back to us in a way that either reassures us, makes us feel something. In my case, like I said, it was, wow, Boys of Summer. Man, did I love that song. Yeah. And I'm sure everybody has a song like that, if not more than one song, obviously. And that's why, and music, so these images, the very first comic book image I saw was not too long after that Twilight Zone image when I saw a cover of Superman when I was in summer camp. Yeah. And my very first cinematic image was Sean Connery as James Bond, Dr. No. My mother, took my brother and I to see that in the summer of 1963 at a drive-in in New Jersey where I grew up. Now, I didn't have a father. My mother was a widow. My father died when I was 4 months old, Paul. So and I've thought about this obviously as an introspective artist that we're supposed to be. Yes. I've given this a lot of thought. And I found my father figures as surrogates in the pop culture. People like Rod Serling became a father figure with that avuncular presence of his and those incredible introductions, which we'll talk about. But the superheroes became my surrogate father figures. Yeah. They were teaching me the difference between right and wrong and good and evil and life and death. And then eventually, as I got older, Bruce Springsteen became a father figure, even though he's only 9 years older than me, I've gotten from him. So that's what's happened in my life, that I've instinctively or subconsciously by the way, as a professional artist, I ended up working for a guy named Neil Adams, who happens to be the greatest living Batman artist. Yes. And when I was 12 years old, when he was one of the gods of comic art, in the same way the scroll Eric Clapton is God,
Yes.
Throughout England. Well, Neil Adams was one of the gods of comic art in the late 60s, early 70s.
Mm.
You had told me when I was 12 years old, Arlen, one day you will be working for Neil Adams. You will be penciling for him, and he will be inking you. I would have had, Paul, a 12-year-old adolescent heart attack.
Not surprised.
And yet that's exactly what happened. So I'm very lucky. But he was like a father figure, obviously, and I got to work for my father figure, and that's a whole trip and a half, if you can imagine.
Yeah.
So the point is I'm very blessed. I'm very lucky that I can even say these things. But it all started, like I said, and the best way I can describe all of this about the things that inspire you when you're a child or when you're young. Somebody handed me a quote by the existentialist writer Albert Camus, who wrote The Stranger. And it was a female friend of mine about 15 years ago, and she said, Arlen, this quote is you. And the quote, which I can now recite by memory, is, a man's work is nothing but this slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened.
Very true.
And that's when she said, this is you, I'm like, oh my God, this is me. Because exactly what I've done is the images, Connery, I did a Connery Bond webinar that I hope to do again in October if all goes well, where I basically deconstruct the first 4 movies, which I think are the Bond canon and the Connery canon. I think Bond jumps the shark, starting with You Only Live Twice. But again, we talk about that more in detail. But the point is I've pursued the things I loved as a child that made me become an artist, and I've made artworks out of them as a weird karmic way of giving back.
Yeah, and it is incredible when we look, because one of there is a very constant selection of themes in the Twilight Zone, and often there are several episodes where people of a certain age, Arlen, are often stuck in a rut or in a unsatisfactory situation, or they feel that their lives are simply going nowhere, and they often seem to reminisce back to a rose-tinted or halcyon version of their childhood. And one of the things about the Twilight Zone is there seem to be some very constant themes, and that was one about often that retrospectively looking back through a prism or a certain viewpoint could often skew how the reality of that experience really is. And I've often found that in the Twilight Zone there's always been those kinds of cautionary tales of dreaming of what we could have been in regards to what we actually end up with.
Well, can you name a specific episode that made you feel that way?
I'm trying to there's one about the particular episode where there's a gentleman who feels that he's stuck in a dead end, and he goes for a walk around his own neighbourhood.
Yes.
And he ends up running into his old friends. I've forgotten the name of that particular episode.
Okay, so since I know these episodes like the back of my hand,
I was
you ready for this?
Yes.
Well, I was going to answer your initial question either in a general way, or I wanted to know if there's a specific episode. Your larger point, before I get into the specifics of that episode, it's called Walking Distance. So remind me in case I go off on a tangent and forget, but we'll come back to it. But in a more general way, I have lectured on, and I discuss this in a lot of my works, something I call the 5 themes of the Twilight Zone. Because years ago, I was given a chance to have 5 days of screening Twilight Zone episodes for a broadcast museum in Chicago. It made me go, okay, I've got 5 days to screen my favorite Twilight Zone episodes. Like, I'm not just going to do a grab bag of like random episodes, even though they're all great, the ones I would choose. I naturally wanted to treat it like a project and say, okay, I've got 5 days. Well, that immediately suggests 5 different themes. And then each day I would choose the episodes that all reflect on that theme. And the reason being is that this was the creation of Rod Serling. While he didn't write every episode, he did write the bulk of them, which, by the way, contained a lot of what I would call bad episodes. I'm very critical when it comes to the Twilight Zone, as I am about all the things I love, whether it's comic book history, artists, certain things, certain comics, certain images, and with Bruce Springsteen's music. I'm very critical of his output, but I'm also very laudatory, so I try to balance my love of an artist's work with also my critical analysis of it.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, there's 156 episodes of Twilight Zone. I think half of them are dogs. I mean dogs. Now that leaves 75 episodes. I think 50 of those are what I call good to great television. Now that obviously covers a lot of ground, Paul. And all judging art is somewhat subjective, but the reason why we have art history and criticism in both literary fields and visual fields is because, we try to come up with a reason why one work of art is better than another. And the word better always has to be in quotes.
Yes.
Because in the end, all art is subjective. That doesn't mean, like I said, that we don't try for some kind of critical consensus. And that's why there are these movie critics that get together every couple of years and vote the greatest movies of all time. And critics in all different things get together. It's not just this open field where everything is equally good or bad.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Just because a layman can say, I think the Mona Lisa sucks, that he's entitled to think that. But that doesn't mean the Mona Lisa sucks.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, everybody has an opinion, but like I said, that doesn't necessarily – anyway, once again, I'm digressing. So, out of those, we're left with 25 episodes after those 50.
Yes.
Those are the episodes that I would show to the aliens if they beamed down in front of me and said they had room on their spaceship for one example of Earth television. I'm giving them these 25 half hours.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give them The Sopranos. I'm going to give them Seinfeld. I'm not going to give them I Love Lucy or Breaking Bad or any other great show you might name. There's only one television show that is the greatest of all time, and I actually call it the father of American popular culture because if you look at any modern science fiction, fantasy, or horror product, I can connect it to Twilight Zone in less than 6 degrees of Serling, which is, of course, a pun on 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean Serling invented these ideas of time travel or mannequins coming to life. Any of the themes when you think of the Twilight Zone, they were all in the science fiction field, in the literary field, in the pulp novels, in the early films. I mean, he didn't invent these ideas, but what he did do, and this is what I get into with my webinars and my essays and everything, is he brought them to this new medium called half-hour American television, a format which, by the way, most half-hours are sitcoms. It's hard to do half-hour drama. Serling mastered it. And not only did he master it, he mastered the art of adaptation. You see, so he took these science fiction concepts that only a small cult were reading. Even the authors themselves were all these California authors that all hung out with Ray Bradbury. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they looked at Serling as a bit of a dilettante that was coming in who wasn't one of them, who was cherry-picking their wares which were only being read by each other writer and this cult audience.
Yeah.
If you got to remember, in the 50s, Twilight Zone was a juvenile entertainment medium as Hollywood saw it. All those films in the 50s with the giant ants and all that crap. Yeah, once in a while there was The Day the Earth Stood Still or Forbidden Planet, that broke free from the worst examples of that genre.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is Serling made science fiction, fantasy, and horror safe for America via the Twilight Zone, via turning these little pulp stories into half-hour, 2-act plays filmed for television. You look at an episode was originally a short story by Richard Matheson, one of the great science fiction luminaries that Serling took from that little cult in California and had him write for the Twilight Zone. And Charles Beaumont, another great writer from that clique.
Yeah.
Matheson wrote a short story called, I think, that was called Disappearing Act, I think. And it was all about, from what I remember, I've never read it, actually. I read about it. But the point I want to make is Serling adapted it into one of the first season episodes, one of my favorite, called, with the unwieldy title of And When the Sky Was Opened.
Yes.
Now that episode is about 3 astronauts that basically crash land back on Earth, and they disappeared from radar for a half hour. Nobody knows what happened, but they survived it. But over the course of the half hour, each one literally disappears into thin air, and no knowledge of him or anything is remembered. And it was an adaptation by Serling. If you read Matheson's short story, it has nothing to do with astronauts, nothing to do with the space program. Serling took the essence of the story about people disappearing with no knowledge left behind of them by the survivors. That was the basic concept that Matheson wrote. And Serling turned it into this, again, beautiful gem of a 2-act play film for television.
Yeah.
And the theme, this existential feeling of not being part of the world, gets to the heart of the existential angst of part of what the Twilight Zone was about. Were those feelings that you couldn't quite describe, but Serling verbally and visually brought them to life.
Yeah.
And those themes, which again, Serling was a survivor of World War II, the greatest generation. Just like guys like J.D. Salinger, who we're only beginning to know now how much his World War II experiences affected him in order to write Catcher in the Rye.
Yes.
But you see, the greatest generation, the cliche is they all came back, didn't talk about their horrible experience in the war because they were so horrible, because they were so young.
Yeah.
If you know what they saw and you were 20 years old, are you kidding me? I didn't even know how they were able to function, any of them, but they did.
Yes.
The point is many cathartically release that trauma through their creativity. People like Norman Mailer and a whole generation of American artists, and in Europe as well, came back and turned their war experiences into their art.
Yeah.
And Serling was no different. There's a great graphic novel out right now, a biographic novel called Twilight Man, by an Israeli graphic novelist who's now living in New York, teaches at School of Visual Arts, Corin Shadmi.
Yes.
And it's called Twilight Man. And it really, I would say, almost two-thirds of it, no, almost half of it, is about his World War II experiences.
Yeah.
And how they shaped what would end up coming later. So, a guy that witnesses when buddies get decapitated right in front of him because a supply crate from their own forces dropped on top of them.
Yeah.
Now, that in itself is a Twilight Zone experience because the irony is that it was his own forces.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Serling channeled experiences like that. What a surprise, into a show about the middle ground between life and death, between science and superstition. Okay, so this gets back to, I'm going to come back to Walking Distance, by the way. But this gets back to the 5 themes of Serling.
Yes.
So I was able to look at my favorite episodes, those top 25 or those top 75, and basically notice that they fell into themes. One of them I called A Question of Identity. There's that great episode, 5 Characters in Search of an Exit.
Yes.
Who are we? Where are we? What are we?
Yeah.
Those are the 3 philosophical questions man has been asking for thousands of years. And they all don't have answers, and that's why we're still asking them. And that's also why we have things like religion, is to attempt to give answers to those 3 questions. How did we get here? What do we do while we're here? And where do we go when we die? Guess what? We still don't have the answers to those things, although we'd like to think we do.
Yes.
So, questions of identity. Another one I called Suburban Nightmares, because so many of the Twilight Zone episodes were set in average American settings, almost like an Edward Hopper painting. If you think of the episode Mirror Image, that takes place in a bus station, with the great actress Vera Miles, who thinks she sees a duplicate of herself. That episode, to me, in my webinars, I describe it as like an Edward Hopper painting in black and white, because if you know your Edward Hopper, he painted these very drab American settings peopled by these very kind of eerie, the shadows figures.
Yeah.
And Mirror Image feels like that to me. It looks like that to me. And existentially, the idea of seeing a duplicate of yourself, another question of identity.
Yeah.
Or it's suburban nightmare, meaning it takes place in a bus station. Some of Serling's and company's greatest episodes took place in places like department, train stations, cars.
Yeah.
Average, I call it, I compare it to American Gothic, you know, that famous painting?
Yes.
With the man and the woman with the pitchfork. I show the image from the masks with the man and the wife in those horrible masks as a kind of mirror image of American Gothic, and I call what Serling and company did a kind of psycho-American Gothic.
Yeah.
Because I grew up going to department stores as a kid. I lived next to Paramus, New Jersey, which was the land of the shopping malls. In the late 50s, they were all built at around the same time. Outdoor shopping malls. This is way before they enclosed them.
Yeah.
And they were the theme parks of our youth. Growing up in the town next to Paramus, going to these shopping malls was like, they were like theme parks. And yet I distinctly remember having this fear. Oh my God, if I was ever, and remember, I'm a kid thinking this. If I was ever locked in one of these department stores at night, all alone in this giant store, it would freak me out. Now, I don't think I used the term freak me out back then, but that's exactly what his greatest episodes is about. A woman getting locked in a department store at night. That's the one where the mannequins come to life. So it's like Serling was able to tap into what I call these seated American neuroses, which of course are universal neuroses because America is the world. You know, we are a nation of immigrants. America is the world. So whatever happens in America is universal. And that's why you from England identify with it and people from Australia. The Twilight Zone is universal, really.
Yeah.
Everybody knows what a bus station is.
Yep.
Even if you're in, India.
Yep.
You know what a bus station is. And the existential angst of seeing a duplicate of yourself or of seeing yourself dead. Richard Matheson wrote an episode called Death Ship. It's one of the only 1 hours that I like.
Yes.
And it's about 3 astronauts that see their own bodies dead. Now, if that ever happened to you in real life, you would freak out. Are you kidding me? That's such an essential existential dread. And yet there's a 1 hour episode is a meditation on that. And so a question of identity, suburban nightmares. One is called Science and Superstition, which is all the episodes that deal with science fiction, obviously. And also superstition.
Yep.
Because there's that great with William Shatner called Nick of Time, also written by Richard Matheson, in which they're a slave to that little devil head fortune-telling machine.
Yes.
So science, superstition, and then let's see, there were 5. Let's see, question of identity, suburban nightmares, science and superstition. I always feel like I leave. Okay, so the last one, or maybe I left one out, is called the time element. And it's all the episodes that deal with time travel, or Serling described the Twilight Zone, a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. Now, remember I said I would return to walking distance?
Yeah.
And even the beginning of our conversation today, Paul, I was talking about art is timeless.
Yeah.
So Serling is already saying, I'm going to give you a TV show about the dimension of imagination, which is as timeless as infinity. He's already setting the bar so high and yet he fulfills it. And he fulfilled that timeless as infinity in I think it was the 5th episode of The Twilight Zone, called Walking Distance. Now, I don't know where to begin with this episode, but since you brought it up, it's about a guy, 36-year-old Martin Sloan, played by the actor Gig Young, who would later win an Oscar in 1970 at Best Supporting Actor for They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And then he had a weird Twilight Zone murder-suicide, which is, cue the Twilight Zone music, because the director of the episode, Walking Distance, only directed one other Twilight Zone episode, but it was the very first one, Where Is Everybody?, with the actor Earl Holliman trapped in a Rockwellian American town that's deserted. Now, you talk about existential angst. You can't get more alienated from reality, Paul, than being all alone in a deserted town.
Yeah.
And at the Twilight Zone, remember, this is a pilot episode. The job of a pilot episode is to lay out the themes that the show is going to be about. What makes Where's Everybody maybe the greatest pilot episode in television history is that you could find a little bit about any of your favorite Twilight Zone episodes somewhere in that episode. He encounters a mannequin. He gets dislocated from reality. Everything that happens to this guy in that 25 minutes is existential, philosophical. It touches on all the major issues, and Serling does it in 25 minutes. I mean, as primers for pure storytelling, if I were teaching Twilight Zone, which I have a syllabus written up, and I've got my MFA degree, if any college out there is listening, hire me. But if I were teaching the Twilight Zone to storytellers, whether it's, directors, it doesn't matter, artists of any type, you want to know how to tell a story in 25 minutes and touch on all the great themes of mankind itself, life and death, God and man, man and the state, good versus evil, man and woman. I mean, are you kidding me? The Twilight Zone was an anthology show. It touched upon all of these great themes. Now, I broke it down, remember 5 themes of the Twilight Zone. All of the great episodes fall under one of those themes in general. Now, there might be 1 or 2 little asterisk episodes that don't quite fit, but believe me, I've given this a lot of thought. I've written a lot about it. And that's how the Twilight Zone is, even though Serling wasn't the sole creator. He created the show, wrote 93 out of the 156 episodes. And again, I think he wrote some of the worst and he wrote some of the best. And then the other episodes are divvied up among Matheson, Beaumont, George Clayton Johnson, another famous science fiction writer, and then, a handful of other writers. But they all wrote under Serling's basic themes, kind of like an auteur. Serling was the auteur of the Twilight Zone in the same way Orson Welles was the auteur of Mercury Theater. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
His ideas and imprint were on the body of work itself, even though those episodes are crafted by different directors, actors, they're collaboration, they're miniature films.
Yeah.
But Serling was the auteur, and that's why, the episodes written by other writers, I think, still fall under those 5 themes. But now, let me return to Walking Distance. Not only is it the greatest time travel episode of The Twilight Zone, Paul, I think it's the greatest time travel story ever filmed. And up against every time travel movie you can think of, whether it's The Time Machine in 1960 with Robert Taylor, whether it's, name any, big, Peggy Sue Gets Married. But there have been a lot of time travel stories and other TV shows with time travel. What makes Walking Distance not only the greatest and Twilight Zone obviously had a lot of time travel episodes.
Yeah.
And many of them are great. Some of them are in my top 25. But Walking Distance is the greatest because, number one, it was the 5th episode, so the whole concept of the Twilight Zone was fresh. But again, a great work of art has to stand on its own. That really doesn't matter. But I think it was the closest to Serling's heart.
Yeah.
In the sense that the idea of Serling was 36 at the time. Serling was an old soul in a young man's body. I mean, the guy died at 50 years old. But when he was alive, he had such nostalgic pangs of regret and loss, mostly centered around his father, who died very young, age 53, I think from a heart attack or a stroke, while Serling was in Europe in 1946 on his extended wartime stay, and they wouldn't even let him go home for the funeral.
No.
So Serling never – and he was close with his father.
Yeah.
Serling, like a lot of American men of the time that went off to the war, they had this idyllic childhood in the 30s. Even though it was the Depression, when you're a kid – for Serling, the early 30s was his golden age.
Yeah.
That's where you get the carousel and cotton candy and everything that Gig Young talks about in Walking Distance is what Serling felt, but comes out of never being able to say goodbye or whatever with his mother.
Yeah.
And that haunted Serling, and that gave him this feeling of age when he was, in a sense, young. And in many ways, this gets into other issues about, did Serling have a death wish? And this gets into, once again, the war experiences of seeing death up close, personal. So you factor all that in. He writes this episode, Walking Distance, about an ad guy, Harry ad exec, right out of Mad Men, who has had enough of the rat race, and he's driving out to the country somewhere up in New York State. Remember, Serling had a place, Binghamton he grew up in, and had a place, Ithaca, Lake Cayuga was a production company. So let's assume Homewood, which is where he walks back in time to, where he grew up, is New York State, outside of New York City. And Serling lived in New York City in the 50s, living in Westport, Connecticut, where I happen to be living now, by the way, cue the Twilight Zone music, commuting into New York City in order to do those 90-minute teleplays in the 50s that won him the Emmys that gave him the creative clout to do the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
So, and then, of course, there's the sister episode to Walking Distance, also from the first season, called The Stop at Willoughby.
Yes.
Which is about another harried exec schlepping in and out of New York City to Westport, by the way.
Yeah.
Can't deal with the pressure. So Serling is feeling that. He writes about it in Walking Distance. Now, what made Twilight Zone great, one of its many great aspects, it didn't rely on special effects. When it did, in certain episodes, they were cheesy. Matheson never forgave The Twilight Zone for two of its greatest Matheson episodes that people love.
Yeah.
But Matheson hated the little Michelin Men astronauts in The Invaders with Agnes Moorehead.
Yes.
Those little – he hated them, which is why he rewrote the episode about a dozen years later. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but you can find it on YouTube. It was this – Movie of the Week trilogy with Karen Black.
Yes.
Cross-eyed. And it was called Amelia, and it was about a woman living in New York City by herself, and she gets a Zuni hunting fetish doll.
Yep.
That looks like this savage little monster, and it ends to life and chasing her around the apartment.
Yeah, Trilogy of Terror.
If that doesn't sound familiar, that Matheson wrote that essentially to rewrite The Invaders with a better monster instead of the little Michelin Men. And then, the episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet with William Shatner.
Of course.
One of the most famous. Not even in my top 25, by the way. Didn't even make the 25 cut. Mostly because the monster is ridiculous. He looks like a guy in a furry ape suit. When he's leaning down to rip up the fuselage.
Yeah.
You can see the vinyl padding on his soles of his feet of the costume. I mean, Matheson hated it. Again, which is why when they remade it in the Spielberg 83 movie with George Miller directing. Okay, so this brings us back. What makes Walking Distance so brilliant? When he goes back in time in the beginning of the episode, the screen doesn't go shimmery, you know, like when Wayne and Garth, you know,
Yes.
would go ooh, with their hands. Most time travel stories always has some special effect, right?
Yeah.
Where they go back in time. If you've seen The Time Tunnel by Irwin Allen.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, remember how they go back in time? Okay. How does Gig Young go back in time? Now, remember I told you the director was a guy named Robert Stevens, television veteran, did a lot of Alfred Hitchcock, but only did 2 Twilight Zone episodes. Where Is Everybody, which is brilliant, greatest pilot episode of all time. And then he comes back to direct Walking Distance, and then that's it. But they're 2 of the greatest episodes of the series. So he's at a gas station, the beginning of the episode, and he asks the attendant, "Isn't that Homewood up ahead?" And the guy goes, "Yeah, about a mile down the road." And the guy goes, "Homewood, I grew up there. Isn't that walking distance?" He goes, "Yeah. By the time you come back, your car will be all, you know, fixed up." So the way Robert Stevens directs him going back in time is he shows him walking away from the gas station, reflected through a mirror on the gas station door, you know, of the office of the gas station.
Yeah.
And then the camera literally goes into, almost like an Orson Welles Citizen Kane move, it goes into the mirror, a la Alice Through the Looking Glass. It's the director saying, now remember, you as a viewer don't know he's walking back in time.
Yeah.
You only know this in retrospect. But again, Twilight Zone, the best episode, didn't hit you over the head. They allowed you to think a little. So all of a sudden you notice he's walking away, but through the mirror. Then the camera goes into the mirror. Then we cut to him entering the drugstore. We still don't know that he's back in time. But over the course of the next 10 minutes, we begin to get the clues that, oh my God, because he starts to see, he sees himself as a child. He meets his parent. And then the episode unfolds. And then you think a little afterwards, wow, he just walked back in time. And you think back, wow, now you don't actually say this, but as a work of art, this is how your thought process would have to operate. You think back later, wow, he showed me him walking back in time by him walking literally through the mirror. No fancy special effects. But that's not even what makes Walking Distance brilliant. That's just the beginning. I would say the second half of Walking Distance, after he gets the initial shock of seeing himself as a child, meeting his parents, we break for the 15-minute Twilight Zone break. Remember I said these are 2-act plays filmed for television.
Yeah.
When we come back from that intermission for the second act of Walking Distance, I call the second act of Walking Distance the Citizen Kane of television. Now, let me digress a second, and don't let me forget that phrase. I just saw a webinar last night by a guy that wrote a book about Bernard Herrmann, the great soundtrack composer who did not only Citizen Kane, but he did all of Hitchcock's greatest films. And then, he composed the original Twilight Zone theme before the famous doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. That was done a year later.
Yeah.
And he did original scores for many of the episodes themselves, including Walking Distance. Now, I'm on this webinar last night because I'm interested to know more about Bernard Herrmann. And this guy literally wrote the book on Bernard Herrmann. And he's going through his life chronologically. He stops on a couple of things he did for Alfred Hitchcock. Same time as Twilight Zone. He skips over Twilight Zone completely. So in the chat board, I post a little line. I go, as we get towards the end of the webinar, I'm like, I can't believe he skipped over the Twilight Zone, especially Walking Distance, which I consider, and I posted this early on in the webinar in the chat board. I said, who doesn't love all of Herrmann's works? But out of all his things, I think the score for Walking Distance is his greatest work. So I was expecting this expert, when he got chronologically up to Twilight Zone, he'd talk about Walking Distance, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't even mention Twilight Zone at all. The webinar finishes. I'm stunned that he doesn't do Twilight Zone at all. You ready for this? So people asking him questions. There's a Q&A afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
They asked the guy, out of all of Herman's works, what is your favorite? What do you think is his best work? And without missing a beat, the guy goes, I think the score he did for Walking Distance. When I say cue the Twilight Zone music, so explain to me how the expert on Bernard Herrmann agree with me that Walking Distance is Herman's greatest work
and doesn't mention it
and not cover it in a Herman webinar.
That makes no sense.
Okay. So somewhere when I wrote my 5 themes of the Twilight Zone, I was trying to describe Herman's score for Walking Distance, and I'm going to try to do it by memory, but I said it's a wistful whine of strings that underscores the futile quest to try to recapture one's youth or something like that. And when you watch this episode and you just listen to Herman's score, it'll break your heart. And when I say the last 15 minutes or 12 minutes of Walking Distance are the Citizen Kane of television, what do I mean by that? You might be wondering. Right, Paul? Are you wondering?
Always.
Why is Citizen Kane, even though it lost out to Vertigo a couple of years ago when those critics got together to vote greatest movie of all time, for the first time in 70-plus years, it wasn't Citizen Kane.
Yep.
Somehow Vertigo came out of left field and leapfrogged over Godfather and Casablanca. And don't get me started. Where is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which to me is the greatest movie of all time? But I digress. The point is Citizen Kane, why is it the greatest movie of all time for 70 years? Well, what do we mean by that? One way of looking at it as it means, since film is a collaborative art form, like television, Citizen Kane is operating at 110% creative level of every facet that goes into a film. Ergo, the concept, the story was a great big American story about a man's life that would represent, in a sense, America itself.
Yeah.
Which was Hearst in a nutshell.
Yes.
The script itself by, Herbert Mankiewicz with Orson Welles' involvement. The photography by Greg Tolan, the cinematography, all the innovation, the depth, that was operating at 110%. The acting, Orson Welles himself as Citizen Kane should have gotten an Oscar.
Yeah.
Every one of these things should have gotten Oscars. And by the way, Bernard Herrmann's score was nominated for an Oscar. I forget what film he lost to. So Citizen Kane was operating, and then there's the sort of X factor of all the innovations in film vocabulary that Welles brought to that film, utilizing great cinematography and a great script and great lighting and great everything. And those all come together, and that is why Citizen Kane for 70 years was, because no other movie in all these critics' opinions for 70 years, in a sense, ever topped it.
Yeah.
Now, there have been obviously 70 years of other great films every year that are given the Oscar, but according to these critics, none of them ever bested Kane until somehow Vertigo did. I love Vertigo, but I don't agree it's better than Citizen. I think it's Hitchcock's greatest film because it's most revealing of Hitchcock as an artist. I mean, that's the way the way Jimmy Stewart manipulates and dominates Kim Novak, given in light of what we know with post #MeToo. I mean, the way he literally forced himself on this poor woman to get her to transform herself into his vision. I mean, that was Hitchcock himself.
Yeah.
If you listen to the stories people like Tippi Hedren talk about, I mean, he tried to molest her in the backseat of his car, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, once again, I digress. Why then is Walking Distance this Citizen Kane of television? Those last 12 minutes. Because in the same way, every creative element that goes into a Twilight Zone episode a 2-act play filmed for television, was operating at 110% creative capacity. The concept, the script, the acting by Gig Young, the photography by George T. Clemens, the direction by Robert Stevens, like I mentioned, the camera thing in the beginning, the close-ups of Gig Young throughout the episode. You know, TV is a medium built on close-up. Well, Twilight Zone had the greatest close-ups of all. The score by Herman is unbelievable. There's a carousel scene at the end of Walking Distance that, in my opinion, is better than the famous carousel scene from Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train.
Yeah.
Better. So if you combine, and then the theme, and when he meets up with the father at the end, and the father has to tell him that he's got to go back to his own time because we only get one summer as a child. This is Serling talking to his own father. You follow me?
Yeah. Yeah, very true.
So, based on everything I just said, if you were to literally watch Walking Distance when we're done talking, Paul, and if the audience listening actually does that, I think you will agree with me because I put you in the frame of mind to hopefully receive it as such.
Yeah.
You will agree with me that the last 12 minutes of Walking Distance is the Citizen Kane of television, and you can't get greater praise than that.
Yeah. Yes, there's certainly a lot at play in that one. I completely appreciate where you're coming from now. Yeah.
Where do you get my bill? You think all that was for free? I just gave you the greatest off the cuff. You think I'm reading from a script? You think I got a teleprompter over here? That was all off the top of my head, man. Give me some props.
One of the other interesting aspects of the Twilight Zone I always found rather compelling, Arlen, is the fact that often he uses a framework to essentially show us that probably the most monstrous thing that we can imagine is actually ourselves. And there's a couple of episodes where I think the shelter is one where essentially you have a close group of friends who essentially end up at each other's throats and basically
and it's just right
lay bare their real personalities under pressure, that just basically whatever, without wishing to spoil the ending.
Oh, come on, spoiler alert.
So I said, obviously they, by ripping into the bomb shelter that their friend has, all of them have released their prejudice and their anger and their selfishness and their greed and everybody, it's a false alarm. It's not a bomb. They're not all going to die.
Yeah. Oops. Right. Oops.
And then the realization that actually what they've been through is probably worse than all being killed, because now everything is different. Everything has changed. They are no
their
longer
real
the
selves.
people. Yeah. And they were some of the episodes that would often move you the most because it turns the camera inwards on people and it makes you.
What did I say about mirror image? It held up a mirror.
Yeah.
To ourselves. We have met the enemy, and it is us.
Yeah.
And I'm quoting Walt Kelly from the comic strip Pogo. But yeah, now, Paul, why don't you relate to the people, since you saw my Twilight Zone webinar last week called Twilight Zone Ahead of Its Time, which is all about episodes like The Shelter and its sister episode, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which aired a year and a half earlier. But they're both about people in typical American Rockwellian suburban towns, which could be in England or it could be here.
Yeah.
And when you deprive our post-war American and world generation of our creature comforts, which are fueled by electricity.
Yes.
You know, forget about this pandemic. I mean, are you kidding me? People suffered during, the Blitz in England.
Yeah.
I mean, our big problem was you got to stay home with all of your Netflix and your computers and your music. And yeah, you got to stay home with your so-called loved ones. You know, the divorce rate spiked during the pandemic because husband and wives realized they can't stand each other when they actually have to live with each other.
Absolutely.
But what I'm trying to say is, what was so bad about that? My life as an independent artist, like every other independent artist I know, nothing changed. I get up, go to work every day in my apartment. I got to come up with ideas, try to make money. I don't go off to a job somewhere. during this pandemic, the rest of the world realized what it's like to actually be an artist. And laymen are discovering the silver lining in this whole pandemic, at least in America, I think, has been people who were laymen who were not thought of to be creative are discovering, wow, I can actually do stuff at home. I can actually be creative. I can actually come up with things and execute them. I don't have to go to work somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think statistics have shown that, contrary to the stereotype that when you work at home you're less productive, companies are discovering when their workers are work from home, they're actually more productive.
Yeah.
And I think the silver lining for companies, not so much good for realtors, they're going to realize, why do I need all this expensive office space? Half of my people can work at home.
Yes.
And they're happier and they're more productive.
Yeah.
And I'm going to save money on office space.
Yes.
So, yeah, not good for realtors, but good for the company. So, for me, like I said, my life, I forage for food once every week. I mean, nothing's changed, and I live on the computer. But so those episodes, The Monsters Do on Maple Street and its sister episode, The Shelter, are both Serling originals, and they're both his take on what happens when our friends and neighbors are deprived from these creature comforts like electricity. And I'm telling you, man, the pandemic was nothing. We had a big storm in early August. We lost power for 2 days. Let me tell you something. I live in a fairly wealthy white suburban town. When we lose electricity, the last time this happened was Hurricane Sandy in 2012.
Yeah.
I told you, wealthy white people were about to kill each other over access to AC ports in the local Starbucks.
Yeah.
To plug in there. I'm telling you, we were one step away from Lord of the Flies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I said, forget about the pandemic. We can live with that. We can't live without electricity.
Yeah.
We will kill each other. And are you kidding me? People, if they didn't have their television to keep them busy during the pandemic, then you would have seen riots that would have made Black Lives Matter look like My Pet Goat.
Yes. Yeah. It is incredible when you look at how clever it seems looking back, and it's very often people will perhaps try and frame some of Serling's work as being ahead of its time, but these themes, they are, Arlen. I completely agree, because the biggest danger is the enemy within. And that's exactly what both of those episodes show, because it's all about, I mean, especially the second episode, because essentially this is an alien invasion, which is simply using man's obsession with creature comforts to turn it upon itself. It's the easiest invasion. Let them do all the hard work. Let them kill each other.
Right. Well, that was Monsters Do on Maple Street.
Yeah.
The Shelter was all about, and this was, again, based on reality in 1961. This was before the Berlin Wall was built.
Yeah.
But in the spring, Khrushchev met Kennedy, who was newly elected. And during that time, he threatened the U.S. that if you don't remove the missiles from around Berlin, I'm going to start a thermonuclear war.
Yeah.
And Kennedy basically answered him, well, I'll make sure we have bomb shelters built in every, major across America.
Yeah.
And according to Serling, over the course of the spring and the summer, the obsession with people building fallout shelters, as the escalation in Berlin heightened. So he immediately wrote and put into production The Shelter, which aired in September of 61. 2 weeks after the episode aired, the Berlin Wall was built.
Yeah.
So Serling was writing from what he perceived living in Southern California in a fairly, obviously Pacific Palisades, wealthy, white, suburban Los Angeles town. And he sensed, and he came up with the Twilight Zone idea. What if friends and neighbors that claim to like and love each other, what if they had a fight over the one bomb shelter that one neighbor decided to build? What would happen? Well, it was Lord of the Flies, basically.
Yeah.
And then I love it, and I showed this episode in my webinar last week. I showed Monsters Are Due last week, clips of it. And I love the ending when they realized it was all a false alarm. The way all of the neighbors who basically I mean, one of them slandered the other as a dirty immigrant. I don't know if he says the word immigrant. Yeah. He says foreigners, which, by the way, obviously sounds like it could be torn from yesterday's headline in America. But basically, that's what makes the episode even more ahead of its time, is this guy sounds like a pro-you-know-who supporter. And this is 1961 when Serling is writing it. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's the same thing with the civil rights movement. Yeah. We've come so far, and yet, we seem like we're back to square one.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other aspects as well, Arlen, is it certainly, when you look at it now, it doesn't seem to fit in. I find it a really forward-thinking show because it is dealing with those issues.
But it was also, right, but you've got to also give it credit. It was also of its time.
Yes, precisely.
It was both. Listen, he did an episode in early 1963 starring Dennis Hopper, one of the 1 hours, called He's Alive. And it's about a Nazi Bud American who ends up getting help in the shadows from Hitler himself. Now, in the early 60s, neo-Nazis were on the rise, along with the Ku Klux Klan, because of the civil rights movement. And yet, here we are 60 years later, and we're back exactly to where we were. Neo-Nazis are on the rise, and the speeches out of Dennis Hopper's mouth that Serling wrote, which was in reaction to what he was seeing in America at the time, which resulted in Kennedy getting assassinated. The hatred that Serling saw from the South because of the Kennedy's stance. So what I'm saying is the definition of art. I told you about Guernica.
Yeah.
It was of its time. It was in reaction to the 1937 bombing of Guernica.
Yeah.
And yet it's a timeless work of art about and humanity of man.
Yeah.
Not only was it of its time, it was ahead of its time, even in its time, because Serling has 1 or 2 episodes about the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
Now, what do I mean by that? If you talk to people and read your history about what people felt during those 2 weeks in October in 1962 worldwide, people literally thought the U.S. and Russia were going to bomb each other and that the world was going to end. And people were making serious plans. And they felt literally that the bomb was going to drop any moment. Serling has an episode about that feeling 2 years before that. And it's exactly what people were feeling 2 years later.
Yeah.
So it's both of its time, ahead of its time, and timeless.
Yeah. I mean, it is, because there are episodes like, I know you featured it in your webinar, Arlen, the Old Man in the Cave, which is one of those where the bomb has dropped and we arrive at a certain point in the future dealing with the ramifications of our stupidity. And yet, once again, it seems that people don't learn anything and they continue to be as stupid as the people that caused the situation.
Right. So in my webinar, I showed that in relation to, look at what happened recently with the pandemic, with all the people that wanted to get out there again ahead of time. And in the episode Old Man in the Cave, another masterful adaptation by Serling of a science fiction writer's short story named Henry Slazar. So again, Serling, the master adapter, shows us how people post-bomb drop are living with nuclear effects, and the food that they're eating might be tainted by nuclear fallout, and should they eat it or should they not? And they have this old man in a cave that's this mysterious entity that's telling them what is tainted and what is not.
Yeah.
And then a little troop of militiamen, sound familiar?
Yeah.
Come riding up to these band of survivors and basically challenges them to go see this old man in the cave because they think it's all BS. And sure enough, spoiler alert, they go to the cave, and what ends up being the old man? A giant computer. Now, once again, this is 1964.
Yes.
This is Serling the Visionary laying out what our future would be. Hello, the computer. There's not that many mentions really of computers in the early 60s, once in a while on a science fiction show. But the point is people that were reading science fiction, that were, reading forward-thinking ideas at the time, they knew the computer was coming.
Yeah.
So Serling wasn't unique in that, but again, putting it on American television. Do you know there are 3 separate Star Trek original episodes, each of the 3 seasons, that are basically knockoffs of Old Man in the Cave?
The Man Traps, the very first episode is essentially that, isn't it?
No.
Oh.
It's the one, I forget the title, but it's the one with Landru.
Yes.
We must, whatever Landru says, and then Landru ends up, Kirk and Spock blast the hole in the wall with their phasers, and there's a computer.
Yeah.
Then in the second season, you get this episode, again, I don't know the title, something called The Apple.
Yes.
And it's about this ancient civilization on another planet that worships the great god Fabal.
Yeah.
And at the end, it's a computer. And then in the third season, there's an episode where they're on another planet and the people are worshiping this god. And what's behind the facade? The computer. You like the way I'm saying that?
Absolutely.
My Centaurian, the computer. But that's what. So what happened with this pandemic? People wanted to either listen to science, i.e., the computer, and wear masks and stay indoors, or you've got the assholes like the militiamen in the episode and in real life. We want our freedom. James Coburn, the great film actor, is in this Twilight Zone episode. Like a lot of great actors who would become movie stars were on the Twilight Zone. And there's this great – I showed it in my webinar, the film clip at the end, where he says to the people that are now destroying the computer, they're actually destroying the computer. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
And he basically says to them, this is what you wanted, didn't you? You've got your freedom. He actually says that.
Yeah.
So this episode, which I end my webinar with, talk about the Twilight Zone ahead of its time. It could have been written yesterday.
Yeah.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the definition of art. Again, of its time, ahead of its time, and timeless. Period.
Yeah. I mean, the other interesting aspect of this is there's obviously a lot of futuristic scenarios, a lot of post-apocalyptic episodes as well. But there are also a couple that I've always really liked, especially from the 4th season, Arlen, because a lot of people don't like the 4th season because the episodes were elongated to an hour, weren't they?
I only like 2 of them. I won't even spend time talking about the other 16. I'm telling you right now.
Okay, well, I'll quickly mention the one I like from that season.
What?
Which is The Devil's Printer. Which I've always been a sucker for that story because I always like it, and Burgess Meredith's very good in it. But the other one that's quite similar to that is The Howling Man, which I think is one of Charles Beaumont's.
Yes.
Which is a wonderful episode, I think, because
not even in my top 25, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I've always been quite odd when it comes to
but you're not alone. Listen. Remember, I told you.
Yeah.
Some of my least favorite episodes are other people's favorite, and vice versa.
Yeah.
There are episodes I love that other Twilight Zone aficionados go, oh my God, I hate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm kidding you when I say a lot of people. I'm in the minority.
Yeah.
Howling Man is a lot of people's one of their favorite episodes.
Yeah. I always like a.
Why?
Because it's that kind of timeless story about is it really who this person says it is? Is it really the devil? Is it really who's telling the truth here? Is it these people that claim to be protecting the world from this evil person, or is the evil person who's allegedly so corrupt he has to be who is right and who is wrong?
But also on a wider scope, it's really about the fact that the devil is us, meaning the devil can be us. The devil is in us. So the metaphor of the story, which for people listening in have never seen it, don't know what it's about a guy travels to a European hermitage and comes upon a guy being kept in a cellar dungeon who claims who they claim to be the devil, but he looks like a regular guy. And long story short, it turns out he is the devil.
Yeah.
And he fooled the guy who represents us, the audience, into letting him free. Spoiler alert. Too little late. But yeah, the point is the real metaphor for that is, again, another we have met the enemy. By being in a pleasing visage that, as we know from the Bible, the devil can assume, it shows that we all have a devil in us that we fight.
Yeah.
And we try to fight good against evil. We try to conquer it. And that's what is one of the timeless themes of everything is about.
Yeah.
It's about dark and light, the dark within us, and you know, how we're really yin yangs. And you try to hope that the good outweighs the bad.
I mean, it's a theme I've always been drawn to when I've enjoyed this kind of medium. Anyway,
yeah.
Because one of my grandfather's favourite films that I watched as a very young boy with him was Daniel and the Devil. Which is where I've always had this love of that kind of storyline from. And I think whenever I see that kind of hidden danger, where basically everything is not what it seems on face value, and often things are not what they may seem, and you know.
But isn't that a metaphor for life in general?
Absolutely.
Is that there are surface. There's everything that's on a surface, and then we have to look beyond the surface and see things as they really are and discover the truth about things. That's a lifelong quest, whether you're an artist or a layman, doesn't matter. It's about perceiving life as it is, not what we project it to be.
If an offer seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Right, there you go.
But
it preys upon our vanity.
Yeah.
You know, the devil can only prey upon that weakness in you and exploit it.
Yes.
You know, so that's really, any devil story is a metaphor for our own struggles with the devil.
Yeah.
The devil within us.
Absolutely. Everyone's temptation is different.
Yeah, exactly. Although many of our temptations are the same.
Yes.
Whether it's money, sex, you know, fame, the usual things. We all crave after, like I said, creature comforts, sensual pleasures. You know, we all crave fame, money, power. These are all the things that the devil, in a sense, uses to tempt us.
I was delighted to see somebody mention the Purple Testament, because that's one of those episodes of The Twilight Zone that has stayed with me since the first time I ever saw it 30 years ago, Arlen.
Why?
And because it was the first time I'd ever seen The Twilight Zone. That first season was, like I say, was probably, for me as a young person, probably, 1990. When it started being shown on UK.
But was that the very first episode you saw, Purple Testament, or just one?
It was the second episode I ever saw.
What was the first one? Do you remember?
Yes, it was Time Enough at Last.
Another great Serling adaptation.
Yeah.
With Burgess Meredith, of course. Now, a lot of people, we remember that episode because of the famous ending, spoiler alert, where he breaks his glasses, right?
Yeah.
But you see, because that's an adaptation, that was the original writer, Lynn Venable, I believe. I believe the reason why we're still debating, did the Meredith character named Henry Bemis, did he deserve his fate? As storytelling structure.
Yeah.
Writers and people love the Twilight Zone. We're still debating on internet boards 60 years later. Did he deserve his... Remember, he had a horrible wife that ripped up his books of poetry,
Yeah.
And he had a boring job as a clerk, but okay, he escaped to read in the basement of the bank, but that's what saves his life. So in the end, as storytelling structure in which characters are either blessed or punished for their actions, and I'm speaking in storytelling structure terms.
Yes.
Did Henry Bemis deserve to basically wind up the way the episode ends? The only man left alive, but can't read the books that he loved because he broke his glasses.
Yeah.
I'm asking you, did Bemis deserve his fate?
You see, this is the thing about that episode. When I first watched it, and the first couple of times I rewatched it, I thought he did.
Why?
Now,
Why?
Because
why did he deserve his fate?
It's one of those. I think it's it's the ignorance of youth, I think, Arlen. And you kind of think, well, he's not really that nice a person either. And then you kind of realise that actually...
What do you mean he was not nice? What do you mean he was not nice?
This is the thing. I think it's one of those episodes that deserves... Not that, a lot of them deserve to be repeatedly watched. But this is one of those that my first initial interpretation of it was wrong. So now I feel terribly sorry for him, and I think it's awful. And it's one of those where you just think...
But a lot of people still think... When I say people are still debating this, you might have changed your opinion. But I'm telling you, it's split about 50-50.
Yeah.
People who consider themselves Twilight Zone fans, just like you and I, they feel he did deserve his fate. And I would say 50% don't. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, as an adaptation, Serling was faithful, obviously, to the author's original. He did not change the ending. But I believe that is not Serling's worldview. I believe had that been a Serling original, I think he would have ended the show with him reading his books with his glasses intact, with the camera pulling away just like it pulls away at the end of the episode to the crane shot where he's left on that rubble of the stairways of to the library. Except if it had been Serling's worldview, I think he would have rewarded him and that would have been a satisfying ending, by the way.
Yeah.
But the reason why we're still debating it is because people remember it, because I really believe the people who think he deserved his fate are wrong. And I use the word wrong in quotes.
Yeah.
Remember, all art is subjective.
Yeah.
But I believe they're wrong in the sense that we're only talking about it because of, like, watching a train wreck. We love to see a car accident.
Yeah.
We revel in the cruelty.
Yeah.
It was a cruel, omniscient storytelling stroke. Like the old stories of the Greek gods who would interfere with man on earth. I'm going to break the guy's glasses. Won't he be screwed? Yeah, do it. And then, why do we remember? Because we love indulging. You talk about the devil in us.
Yeah.
We love indulging in cruelty of others. It's the ultimate schadenfreude. And that's why that episode – now, I'm not saying if it had ended the way I said, had Serling written it, I think it would still be considered one of the great episodes, but maybe it would not be up in the top 3 or top whatever it is. And I don't think people would have remembered it and why it's discussed. But we remember it because, do you believe his glasses broke? Meaning, how cruel. Isn't that great? I love, people love the cruelty.
Yeah.
And that was not Serling's worldview. That was not his intention. It was an adaptation, and people don't remember that.
Yeah. No, well, very true. Like I said, the reason I've changed my opinion is when I first watched it, I think it's because you don't appreciate it or understand his personal situation. Like you say, his wife spoils his books, and he's...
Why did you feel bad? Why would you say he deserved his fate? Look at the wife that he had.
Well, I know, yeah. But it is now. It's one of those where over the last 20 years, I've really shifted the other side, and I don't understand why I didn't want him.
Right.
Why I didn't feel sorry for him.
But again,
now, it's tragic.
But again, people think, oh, he didn't take part in society. The people who think he deserved his fate, they basically say, well, he didn't really take part in society. He was a loner. He didn't really interact with people. And so he kind of deserved his fate, which I find to be a very flimsy defense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like I say. My defence is the ignorance of youth, Arlen, and I'm sticking with that.
Okay, but I'm letting you know, people who are not young and ignorant. Like I said, plenty of older, dyed-in-the-wool aficionados. I'm telling you, it's about a 50-50 argument these days.
Yeah.
Did he deserve his fate or did he not?
Yeah. And I think the other memorable thing is Meredith's incredible in that. He's a tour de force.
He was a great actor. Yeah, but I like him even better in the episode Obsolete Man.
Yes.
Where he plays the librarian. That was the last episode of the second season.
Yeah, yeah.
And he plays a librarian who's declared obsolete.
Yes, but there he gets the upper hand in that one due to his intelligence.
Yep.
I think
that's my favorite. Right, that's my favorite Meredith episode.
Yeah, I think that's a nice repointer. He gets the victory I think he should have had in that episode, Arlen. Whether it was designed for him to kind of bookend that episode, Time Enough at Last, I'm not too sure. But I've always kind of found them sort of parallels to each other because they're both book-based.
Yeah,
and
exactly. In fact, in the second episode, his actual name is Wordsworth.
Yes.
And I love the way Fritz Weaver, as the Chancellor of the state, he actually announces Wordsworth, a man of words. I mean, if I were an editor, I would have said to Rod Serling, hey, Rod, maybe that's a little on the nose, like a librarian named Wordsworth. I mean, come on, Rod. But, when you're the creative director, the showrunner in today's parlance, you get you get things like that should have been changed, but were not because it's his show.
Yeah.
But yeah, Wordsworth, but I love the fact that the character actually makes fun of the fact that it's so on the nose.
Yeah.
So Serling had the self-awareness. But yeah, and you know what? It's an incredible episode because what does Meredith do, the character, when he knows he's going to get blown to bits? He takes out his banished illegal Bible and starts reading words from the Old Testament. Now, we live in a culture war ever since about getting religion on television and in the schools. And here's Serling, who was a Jewish man, but actually converted to Unitarianism to please his wife, who was Unitarian. And to make a long story short, Unitarian is basically Christianity or Judaism without the supernatural elements. They don't believe really in a God or a son of God, but they feel that the ethics and the morals of these religions are worthy.
Yeah.
But Serling always said he believed in God, but he converted Unitarian. So I believe as a Jew, as a Jew myself, I believe his Jewish worldview as almost an Old Testament prophet, which is what Serling was, but in the 20th century. Giving us these warnings about ourselves and about our society and about the future. And, he fulfilled what, and if you read the Old Testament, that's what those prophets did, is they rebuked and they reprimanded the people at the time for their sins.
Yeah.
And warning them what would happen if they weren't nicer to their neighbors, if they didn't take care of the poor and the needy. Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't really about the fact that they were committing sodomy. They weren't doing what they were supposed to. They weren't taking care of the poor. They weren't taking care of the widows. They weren't taking care of the homeless. This is why God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. Anywho, I digress. Back to Serling. So, what was the episode we were talking about? I forgot again. See, this is what happens.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay. The Purple Testament, because it was like I say.
So the Purple Testament comes right out of his World War II experience that I was talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
This is a guy that saw, like his whole generation, they saw death when they were still young men. They were boys, basically, and they were thrown into the cauldron of life and death. And they were scarred by it, and some were scarred irreparably. Some were able to cathartically turn it into their own. Serling had nightmares the rest of his life. Woke up, screaming and sweat and thought the enemy was coming to get him. And yet the irony is that crate, I told you, dropped from his own forces.
Yeah.
So he writes an episode years later, Twilight Zone, about a guy in the army who can actually see the light of death on people's faces. So that's every episode of Twilight Zone, to be a Twilight Zone episode, has to have something metaphysical about it. It can't just be like an Alfred Hitchcock episode, which had surprise endings too. It has to have something metaphysical.
Yeah.
And that's what separates the Twilight Zone. And what was metaphysical was Serling took this feeling that he felt in the war, that at any moment your best buddy can basically be decapitated in front of you. And he transmogrified, I don't know if I'm using that word correctly, but he translated that experience, that visceral life and death experience, into a Twilight Zone episode in which metaphysically a guy, Serling's doppelganger, i.e. the audience, can see the look of death on people's faces through a kind of lighting effect. And of course, spoiler alert, the irony at the end was that he looks at himself in a mirror and he can see the look of death on his own face.
Yeah.
And sure enough, he gets blown up at the end in a Jeep.
Yeah.
And that was right out of Serling's war experiences turned into a half-hour Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah. And that's always struck me, that particular episode, because of that, Arlen, because he knows he's going to die and he still goes.
Well, what's he going to do?
Well, exactly, and it's that kind of.
And by the way,
you can't escape your fate.
Right, but here's the other thing: they drive him away in a Jeep. He thinks he's going home, pun intended.
Yeah.
And he looks at the Jeep, the driver of the Jeep, who, by the way, is a young Warren Oates.
Yeah.
You know the actor Warren Oates?
Yes.
In that episode, he's like 20 years old or something, and he's the Jeep driver.
Yeah. Yeah.
And think about it. The guy knows he's going to die, and he goes to sit in the Jeep, and he looks at the driver, and he can see the death in his face, so he knows they're both going to die.
Yeah.
And what can he do? He knows from the previous 20 minutes that every time he sees that look on somebody's face, they die.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the resignation on his face, the kind of very calm acceptance of death, which was also a recurring theme of many Twilight Zone episodes, accepting death as just another stage in the journey of life.
Yes, yeah, because there is often there are several episodes as well where the Hitchhiker. Yeah, the Hitchhiker's one where characters seem to be trying to avoid death or dying.
Yes, there's that Civil War episode called The Passersby.
Yes.
That takes place at the end of the Civil War, and everybody's walking down the road. And by the end of the episode, you realize those are all the dead people walking to the afterlife, and the people in the episode on the side of the road watching them, it turns out they're dead too.
Yes.
And, again, when I compare this to movies of today, The Sixth Sense.
Yep.
Remember, I Can See Dead People. that whole episode, and this there's no big secret, but, M. Night Shyamalan was a Twilight Zone fan like the rest of us.
Yep.
And he's been trying to kind of do the Twilight Zone ever since. And all of his movies have had this Twilight Zone twist at the end, which in the case of The Sixth Sense, they come right out of the Twilight Zone. The idea that he was dead all the whole time.
Yeah.
It's basically The Hitchhiker. Again, another masterful Serling adaptation of the famous short story by Louise Fletcher, who wrote the episode, who wrote the famous radio play, Sorry, Wrong Number.
Yeah.
Who, by the way, was married to Bernard Herrmann.
Yes, yeah.
You like the way this all connects?
Absolutely. And the episode with Robert Redford, Arlen.
Yes, also an acceptance of death. I show that in my webinar.
Incredible.
About an old woman being isolated in New York City in a basement apartment. And she thinks Robert Redford is Mr. Death. But he's a policeman who's been shot, dying at her doorstep. But she lives in isolation. Sound familiar? She gets all her food delivered. She's totally socially distanced and isolated.
Yeah.
But she decides to let Robert Redford in because he's so good looking. He can't be Mr. Death. Mr. Death is supposed to be, Mr. Death.
Yeah.
Not Robert Redford.
Yeah.
And she breaks down and she lets him in to take care of him and nurse him back to health. And, of course, spoiler alert, by the end of the episode, he is Mr. Death, of course.
Yeah.
In a pleasing visage, but he basically holds out his hand to her and says, listen, don't worry about it. It's just another stage of the journey of life.
Mm.
And she touches his hand. Oh, and the way she finally touches his hand, beautiful moment. Written by George Clayton Johnson, by the way. Mm. And he goes to her mother. He says the word mother, which, by the way, again, as a primer on storytelling, by him uttering the word mother to her to get her to touch his hand, with one word, he opens up in the audience's mind an entire backstory.
Yeah.
That the character, maybe he appeared in a visage, the Robert Redford look. Maybe by saying mother, maybe she had a son years ago that died.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But all it is one word, and that's it.
Yeah.
And you, the audience, have to, and it's beautiful. It's an incredible moment. The music rises to a crescendo when he says mother, and she finally touches his hand.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's part of the Twilight Zone ahead of its time in terms of dialogue and situations of quarantining, isolation, and solitude.
Yeah.
That so many of the episodes were about.
Yeah. I mean, and for me, I've always found it very odd because when I viewed that episode, I don't think she is living. She's not living. She's existing. She's hiding.
Right.
This fear of death has become the only reason she's going forwards. She's not.
Right. And that's exactly the metaphor.
Yeah.
For, in her case, getting out and living meant dying.
Yes.
How ironic, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, she was living a kind of living death, which is what people have been struggling with during this pandemic.
Yeah.
Who had their identity in going to work. And now they're home and they don't know what to do and they don't have the money. And, you know, it's a real life jolt for so many people, you know, struggling to deal with it. I mean, my heart goes out to everybody. And listen, we're all struggling in our own separate ways. And that's what 5 characters in search of an exit is about.
Yeah.
We're 3 billion characters in search of an exit.
Yes.
You know, and that's why that episode is timeless and universal.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite episodes. That's in my top 3.
Yeah.
I've told you about all the episodes that are not in my top 25. Don't you want to know what made it into my top 25?
I mean, I've always found that's another theory that runs through the series is episodes that focus on toys or inanimate objects that aren't what they seem. I can think of 2 prime examples of The Dummy, which is essentially magic ripped that episode off.
The greatest ventriloquist story ever of the dummy coming to life is the Twilight Zone dummy.
Yeah.
There have been other TV. Alfred Hitchcock did an episode called The Glass Eye.
Yes.
There was a movie in the silent era called Gabby something or other.
Yeah.
And then there was the English film Dead of Night in 1945.
Yes.
That had a half-hour segment. And the movie Magic with Anthony Hopkins. Bottom line is, compared to the half-hour dummy episode, again, another masterful Serling adaptation of a short story. With the great Cliff Robertson as the ventriloquist.
Yes.
That dummy Willie, when he said, "Jerry, you stupid jerk, you put words in my mouth. You made me talk. Wait, are you satisfied from the song of the same name? Are you kidding me? That's the greatest dialogue ever."
Yeah, and it's always one of those great episodes as well where our central character, everybody's thinking, has he lost his mind? He's clearly gone mad. This dummy can't be alive. And I mean, the bit that always still gives me goosebumps is when it bites his hand, and you think, oh.
He goes, "Willie, how could you be real when you're made of wood?" And Willie answers, "You put words in my mouth. You made me speak. You idiot. You made me what I am today. I like repeating that. Are you satisfied from the song of the same name?" Is there really a song called Satisfied? I've always wondered, is there a song? I know there's the I Can't Get No Satisfaction.
Yeah.
But when Serling writes those lines, are you satisfied from the song of the same name?
Yeah.
Somebody out there listening, do the research and get back to us.
But yeah, the other one, I know a lot of people, a couple of my friends, their favourite episode is Living Doll. Telly
Savalas.
Yeah, which obviously got a wonderful Telly in it.
Now, you ready for this? That episode, you know who does the voice of Talkie Tina?
I've forgotten her name, but wasn't she a really famous voice actress?
Very famous. The most famous. So famous that you don't even know her name. But Her name was June Foray.
Yes, that's her name.
And she was the voice of Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Yep.
And literally 1,001 cartoon characters from all the major companies. She was the number one. She was like the female Mel Blanc, if you know who Mel Blanc was.
Legend, yeah.
So let me give you this quick little Twilight Zone story. So the year is 1991. My coffee table book, Visions from the Twilight Zone, comes out, and I go on a little mini book tour of the West Coast, L.A., San Francisco. And I'm in L.A., and I'm doing a radio call-in interview from my hotel room one morning. And I'm talking to the radio DJ about the Twilight Zone and my book. And he goes, Arlen, there's somebody calling in that wants to speak to you. I'm like, great. And this is what I hear on the other end of the line, Paul. I'm Talkie Tina, and I want to kill you. They actually got June Foray. You know, she died only like a couple years ago.
Oh.
They actually got June Foray to call in.
Yeah.
How great is that?
Awesome. That's probably...
And by the way, remember I mentioned Bernard Herrmann?
Yeah.
And how he did so many original soundtracks for, you know, a lot of the episodes they use what's called stock music.
Yes. Yeah.
But then a number of the great composers of the time who later became famous movie composers, like Jerry Goldsmith, for instance.
Yeah.
But Herrmann not only did the original Twilight Zone theme from the first season, but he did the original scores of individual episodes like Walking Distance that are just gorgeous. And one of them, the later ones, was Living Doll. The next time you watch that, listen to the uniqueness of the score, because it's a low, I think, oboe that he uses throughout the episode as like the theme instrument.
Yeah.
And I only learned this watching it recently. I was noticing the music, and I'm going, you know, that's always been a unique theme that was only on Living Doll. And I said, I wonder if that was Herrmann, because it was late. It was the 5th season, and maybe Herrmann had only done some of the early seasons. I didn't really know for sure. And sure enough, the credits came on, and music by Bernard Herrmann. So vindication sometimes is oh so sweet. You like that?
Oh, very true. Very true. I mean, there is a lot of wonderful episodes, and that's always something that always struck with me as well. It's one of the first instances I can remember where a series would often revisit toys being real or having powers beyond our comprehension, right. and numerous ones. I'm trying to think of the
well, there was one about a camera, there was one about a television that told the future, the camera told the future. You know, there was the machines coming to life called A Thing About Machines. There was an episode called You Drive about a car coming to life, which is where Stephen King got Christine from. And you know, again, well, and that's because, again, Serling, looking out at the American landscape, realized that in the post-war American world, we had become, in a sense, slaves to the machine. And therefore, he had many episodes that were – and now look at the English Black Mirror television series, which is really the best homage to Twilight Zone, better than any of the so-called Twilight Zone remakes, including the most recent one on CBS All Access by Jordan Peele, which I think overall I give it a thumbs down. But Black Mirror, on the other hand, that's because Charlie – is it Brooker or Booker?
Yeah, Charlie Brooker.
Charlie Brooker decided to take only that theme of technology gone awry and figure this is the overarching theme of the 21st century. Out of all of those themes, remember I said 5 themes of the Twilight Zone?
Yes.
You know, he took this idea of technology gone awry, and all of the Black Mirror episodes are basically reflections on that theme. And that's why it's a great homage to Twilight Zone, because Twilight Zone, that was only one of its themes. Technology gone awry or run amok.
There's so many episodes we could cover, and perhaps one day.
I will talk Twilight Zone all you want, but we plug. I need some ticket sales. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, and I hope one day you'll come back and we can talk about some other Twilight Zone episodes.
Anytime. Listen to me. I'll be a regular guest with you. If you want to talk about Twilight Zone once a week, be my guest. I will always be available to talk about any of the things I love with you, Paul. You just let me know. Well, but if you ever want to talk Twilight Zone at any time, I'm available.
That's very kind of you, and I will hold you to that, my friend. Thank you very much. So
I'm going to hold you to that. What do you mean you're going to hold me to that? I dare you to have me back on to talk about Twilight Zone. How about that?
Right.
You're going to hold me to that.
It's a deal.
Yeah, it better be a deal.
This could be an episode in itself.
There you go.
Right.
Life imitates art.
Indeed it does. So then, as we've touched on, you've got a lot coming up. We share very similar passions. So what have you got coming up, and where can everybody else keep up to date with you? Fire away, my friend.
Okay, so I'm going to basically lay out what I have going on the month of September. I've been doing these webinars since April 1st with a company out of New York City called New York Adventure Club. And their website, very easy to remember, nyadventureclub.com. And you'll see their calendar of events. They've got like 3 webinars every day. But you'll be able to recognize mine because not only my name, but my distinctive pop graphics are very different. Most of the other things are historical, kind of walking tours of New York City, and everything's virtual now as a webinar. But my things are pop culture. They don't necessarily have anything to do with New York City. But it's a great platform to do these webinars on. So the month of September and going into October, I've got 5 webinars coming up that really cover all of my favorite pop culture subjects, including the Twilight Zone. So starting on Wednesday the 16th, I do a webinar on the history of Jews and comics, because the Jewish people created not only the original superheroes, Superman, Batman, and down the line, Captain America, but they also created the comic book itself, the reading medium of the comic book. So I've done this webinar before. I've done it in New York City for cultural, religious institutions, and that'll be coming up on this. All of these you can find by going to nyadventureclub.com. Then only 2 days later, on Friday the 18th, I'm doing a webinar on Bruce Springsteen's greatest single show, which is celebrating its 42nd anniversary the very next day on September 19th, back in 1978. I and many Bruce aficionados consider that particular show his greatest show. Now, you might say, if you know something about Bruce, Arlen, he's been, touring for 40 years. How can that show be his greatest show? Well, come to my webinar. I'll tell you why. I happen to be in the 6th row of that famous show, which is part of the story. But I couldn't get the 19th itself, though they gave me the 18th. So on the eve of the 42nd anniversary of Bruce's greatest show, I will do a webinar. And again, if you go to my website, which is the other great resource for all my information, because everything, my webinars, my merchandise, everything is linked, my illustrations, from my website, which is basically my name, arlenschumer.com. And make sure you spell Arlen right, A-R-L-E-N like a Norman. And Schumer is S-C-H-U-M-E-R, just like Chuck Schumer and Amy Schumer, the 2 famous Schumers. I'm the 3rd unknown Schumer. Anyway, so you go there, and there where you'll see on the homepage there is a Twilight Zone icon. You click on that, and you will see all of my other Twilight Zone works, which if you're a Twilight Zone fan, you're going to love. And there's also a Bruce Springsteen icon, and you'll click on my other Bruce works. So that's the 2nd webinar in September. Then the following week, on Thursday the 24th, another comic book webinar, but it's about Roy Lichtenstein, the famous fine artist and pop artist, whose work 60 years later is still being debated on whether it's even art itself or whether it's just pure plagiarism. That if you know anything about Lichtenstein's paintings, that he basically took from comic book panels and pages of the time. I happen to be pro Lichtenstein, and most comic book people I know hate him, and yet I am willing to do this webinar, and I welcome all Lichtenstein haters, because I will school you on why he is one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. Certainly the greatest pop artist. And I got evidence to back it up. I also, so that's on the 24th. Then the week after in September, on the very last day of September, Wednesday the 30th, it's the 60th anniversary of my other favorite show from the 60s, The Flintstones. Now, who else, Paul, is going to do a major look, an anatomy of this pop culture classic known as The Flintstones? Who else but me? Nobody else is doing it. But you come and it's a webinar version of actually a lecture I gave at the Norman Rockwell Museum a couple of years ago, which had a major Hanna-Barbera exhibit. Even though it's the Rockwell Museum, they're trying to expand their holdings to be more about 20th century Americana. So I gave a lecture on the Flintstones then, and I'm going to do it as a webinar a couple of years later. So tune in for that. That's Wednesday the 30th. Then 2 days later, on October 2nd, the exact Friday night, 61st anniversary of the Twilight Zone's debut on October 2nd, 1959, which was also a Friday night. And here's what's going to make it great. Not only am I going to do a 2-hour webinar that's really about the Twilight Zone's place in the artistic culture, how it was influenced by surrealism that preceded it, but then in turn influenced everything from psychedelia to film, television, modern art, and popular culture. And when that ends, it'll be 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, my time. 10 o'clock 61 years ago is when the very first episode debuted on a Friday night. I'm going to be able on the 61st anniversary to screen the very first episode, Where Is Everybody, at 10 o'clock Friday night, October 2nd, 2020, exactly 61 years to the minute that it debuted in 1959. You like that?
Brilliant.
So, and then the other thing to say, so those are my next 5 webinars. You'll be able to get tickets at nyadventureclub.com. If you go to arlenschumer.com, I have a blog where I post all of the webinars and links. The tickets are only $10. And the good thing about these webinars is that people think if they can't see it live, they're not going to buy a ticket if they're busy or they have work to do. The great thing about New York Adventure Club is when you buy a ticket, even if you can't catch it live, you can watch a recording of the live webinar, which in the case of a webinar, when you go to see it later, it's just like as if you were seeing it live for up to a week afterwards. So even if you can't make it live, and I know for an English and European audience, 8 o'clock my time on the East Coast of America is 1 a.m. your time, right?
Yep.
Well, all I can say is, even if you got to go to work the next day, I guarantee you if you stay up for my webinars, yeah, you might be a little tired the next day, but suck it up. It'll be worth it.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
So, yeah, God forbid you stay up late one night for a good reason once in a while. So, anyway, that's what's coming up. And then just as a side note, I was also handed a 2-hour internet radio show to do whenever I want. And it's on this Blog Talk Radio network. And the bottom line is I'll have links, again, on my website. Also, if you're Facebook friend me. I post everything on my – that's where I have the most interaction with my audience is through Facebook. Even though I'm on Instagram and Tumblr and Twitter, I don't get the interaction that I get on Facebook. So feel free to Facebook friend me, and then you'll always get updates about everything that I'm doing. But this 2 hours of radio on the internet, I'm able to schedule before each of the 5 webinars to basically talk about the webinar and the themes of that webinar. And I'm able to get some really good people that I've known for years that are experts in each of the fields. So, for instance, on Lichtenstein, what if I told you, Paul, there's a guy named David Barcelou that got his MFA degree, and he runs a website called Deconstructing Lichtenstein, in which he basically shows you all of Lichtenstein's source images to every one of his famous paintings. Now, I'm able to get this guy because we're Facebook friends for years. He's going to come on my radio show so we can have it out about Lichtenstein. So it's going to be like, what was that, death match, where I'm going to be pro-Lichtenstein, he's anti-Lichtenstein, and, we're friends, and it'll be good-natured. But it's a real coup that I'm able to get him to come on. So, all these radio shows, I'll be posting links, but they're always going to be preceding each of the webinars. Now, for instance, the Twilight Zone one, good one to end on. That's on Friday, October 2nd. So Thursday, the day before, the night before, also at 8 p.m. on my 2-hour radio show, I'm calling it 10-minute Twilight Zone testimonials by telephone. You like that alliteration?
Awesome.
Basically, I'm getting 10 people if all goes well. I've got, I think, 6 out of the 10 committed. I'm getting 10 people who have written books on the Twilight Zone or respected Twilight Zone experts. I even got Rod Serling's, one of his daughters, Anne, to call in. They're going to call in for 10 minutes, and I'm going to, sequence them out for the 2 hours, and each talk about with me their favorite Twilight Zone episode or Twilight Zone experience. And 10 minutes is a nice chunk of time to kind of talk about that.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to these 2-hour radio shows that precede each one of my webinars. So, like I said, they're kind of hard to find, but once you get connected to me and go to my website, my blog page, Facebook me, you'll be able to get links to all of these things that I'm doing.
Absolutely fabulous. And I'll make sure I put links in the show notes for everybody as well.
Yeah, and also, by the way, all of my handles on the internet, I don't hide behind pseudonyms.
Yeah.
So I'm usually Arlen Schumer. So, for instance, on Instagram, I'm at Arlen Schumer. Twitter, I'm at Arlen Schumer. I mean, I don't hide behind any fancy, names like that. So if you want to find me on Tumblr, just, once you put in the name Arlen Schumer, you should get to me. I try not to play those kind of games. I try to be as open as possible, as I've been on this radio show.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, Arlen. Thank you.
Well, Paul, thank you, man. And again, anytime you want me, I've had a ball. And as they say, I hope it was as good for you as it was for me.
Absolutely. It's been a real pleasure.